They called her the help, the silent woman paid to wipe noses and scrub floors. But for 9 years, through the blur of his grief, she was the only mother his twins ever knew. He never saw her, not really, until the day a single letter from the foster care system arrived, threatening to take his children away, and he finally learned her name wasn't on the form, it was on their birth certificates. This is the story of Alexander Vance, an art smuggler who thought he lost everything when his wife died, and of Ilara, the young woman he hired to clean his penthouse, who quietly rebuilt it. For nearly a decade, she was the architect of his children's world, while he saw only the furniture she dusted. But that letter from Child Services didn't just expose a lie. It threatened to dismantle the only family those children had ever known. And it forced a single, terrifying question: who, in the eyes of the law and of the heart, was their real mother? Alexander Vance's world was one of silent auctions and whispered provenance, moving stolen Renaissance portraits through shell companies in Geneva. His wife, Leila, was his anchor to the light, a conservator from a legitimate museum family who didn't ask where the money came from. The twins, Leo and Sophia, were born in the spring of 2014. And when Leila died of a sudden aneurysm just 8 months later, the machinery of Alexander's grief had only one setting: keep moving and don't look back. He hired Ilara Santos through a discreet agency 3 weeks after the funeral. She was 24, with limited English and impeccable references from a diplomat's family in Brussels. The job description was simple: live-in housekeeper, tidy the penthouse, do the laundry, prepare meals. The unspoken contract was simpler: see nothing, say nothing, be a ghost. What Alexander didn't write down, and what he never intended, was the clause about childcare. But on her first day, she found Leo wailing in a soiled onesie, abandoned in a playpen next to a half-empty bottle, while Alexander shouted into a satellite phone in his office, arranging a shipment of looted Etruscan vases. She picked the baby up without being asked. She just did it. And that's how the silent rebuild began. For Alexander, the next 9 years were a blur of airport lounges and secure storage lockers. His fortune ballooned, but his home was a museum of absence. He'd return for a weekend, see the children clean and quiet, and leave again. He registered their first words, their first steps, as calendar notifications on his phone, brief moments of pride before the next deal consumed him. He paid Ilara $900 a week, cash, never asking how she managed. He didn't know she was using her own money to buy them books, or that she'd taught herself to recognize the early signs of Sophia's asthma. He didn't know she'd secretly taken them to every pediatrician and dentist appointment, signing the forms as E. Vance, Mother Guardian, because no one else would. The system, you see, is built to fail the invisible. Domestic workers are excluded from the very labor laws that protect everyone else, a relic of racist policies from the 1930s designed to marginalize black women. They operate in a legal gray zone, and for a nanny like Ilara, that meant no health insurance, no paid sick days, and absolutely no formal recognition as a primary caregiver. In the eyes of the state, she was a phantom. But in the neurobiology of 2 developing children, she was the sun. Studies on attachment are unequivocal. The person who provides consistent, nurturing care becomes the primary attachment figure, the template for all future relationships. By their second birthday, Leo and Sophia's world didn't orbit their father, the occasional comet streaking through the sky. It orbited Ilara, their constant, silent star. The first crack in this fragile arrangement came not from within, but from the cold logic of bureaucracy. In the spring of 2023, a routine audit of a shell company Alexander used in Luxembourg triggered a wider financial investigation. The IRS and Interpol began tracing his assets. As part of a standard risk assessment, Child Protective Services in New York was quietly notified. A case file was opened on Alexander Vance, single father, high-risk profession, frequent unexplained absences. The social worker assigned, a weary veteran named Gail, saw the red flags immediately: no documented secondary guardian, no consistent school involvement from the father, and a primary caregiver with 0 legal standing. Gail's first visit was a Tuesday. Alexander was in Zurich. Ilara answered the door, the twins hiding behind her legs. Gail saw a clean, loving home, but her checklist demanded paperwork, proof of guardianship, proof of the caregiver's right to make medical decisions. Ilara had none of it. She had only a story, told in hesitant English, about a man who was always away and a promise she made to a dying woman she'd never actually met. Gail left a notice of inquiry. The official letter followed 2 weeks later. It was addressed to Alexander Vance. It stated that due to concerns of chronic parental neglect and an unstable custodial environment, a court hearing was scheduled to determine the temporary placement of Leo and Sophia Vance in foster care. It listed the evidence: father's absence, lack of a legal guardian, undocumented caregiver. Alexander opened the letter on a private jet over the Atlantic. The words foster care hit him with a physical nausea he hadn't felt since Leela's death. He'd built walls against grief, but this was a terror he hadn't engineered. He stormed into the penthouse at 3 a.m., the letter crumpled in his fist, ready to unleash his fury on the world, on the system, on Ilara for letting this happen. He found her asleep on the sofa, a twin curled under each of her arms, a children's book open on her chest. The sight stopped him cold. In the dim light, he didn't see his employee. He saw a tableau of a family, whole and complete, from which he was utterly excluded. The next morning, he met with his high-priced lawyer. "We need to establish a legal guardianship immediately," the lawyer said. "Name a relative, a friend, we'll petition the court." Alexander had no one. His parents were gone. Leela's family had cut him off. His business associates were predators. There was only Ilara. "The maid," he said, the word tasting like ash. "Put her down." The lawyer began drafting the forms. But when he requested the twins' original birth certificates from the city records department, a discrepancy emerged that sent a chill through the entire legal team. The documents arrived by secure courier. Alexander spread them on his desk. Under father, his name was listed. Under mother, the space was not blank. It did not say Leela Vance, deceased. It said Ilara Santos. The pen slipped from Alexander's fingers. He stared at the flowing, familiar signature. It was Leela's handwriting. His dead wife had signed these forms, naming her children's future maid as their legal mother. A secret baked into the very foundation of their identities. He thought of the chaotic weeks after the birth, Leela handling the paperwork while he was handling a situation in Cairo. He'd never looked. He'd just signed where she pointed. This was her final, desperate act of foresight. She had seen the man he was, and she had silently appointed his replacement. Alexander drove back to the penthouse in a daze. He found Ilara in the nursery, packing a small suitcase. She looked up, her eyes red. She had received a formal termination notice from his lawyer, a severance check for $20,000. "The hearing is in 72 hours, she said, her voice steady but broken. "I cannot fight them for your children. I am no one, so I will go, and they will have one less trauma to forget." She closed the suitcase. And then she said the words that would detonate Alexander's understanding of the last decade. "But you should know, Mr. Vance, the money you paid me, it is all in a trust for their university, every dollar. And the reason Sophia's asthma is controlled is because for the last 5 years, I have been her mother on every medical form. I have lied for you. I have broken laws for them. And now I will disappear as you always wanted." She turned to leave, her hand on the doorknob. Alexander finally spoke, his voice a ragged whisper. "The birth certificates, Leela named you. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ilara paused, her back to him. "Because it wasn't for you," she said. "It was for them. And because I thought one day you would look up from your money and see us, but you never did." She opened the door. And in that moment, Alexander Vance, the man who trafficked in secrets, realized he was about to lose the only truth that mattered. He had 72 hours to learn a lifetime of devotion or lose his children forever. But first, he had to ask the woman walking out the door the one question that now haunted him. "Ilara, who are you?" Ilara Santos let the suitcase drop. She didn't turn around. The question hung in the penthouse air, heavier than any stolen masterpiece. "Who are you?" For 9 years, the answer had been a function, the maid. But in the shadow of that legal letter, the function shattered, revealing the architecture of a life built entirely on sacrifice. "I am the daughter of a woman who did this for other people's children until her back gave out," she said, her voice low. "I am the trust fund for your son's engineering degree. I am the panic button for your daughter's lungs at 2 a.m., but legally, I am a ghost, and ghosts cannot win custody battles." Alexander moved to stop her, his hand on her arm. It was the first time he had touched her without handing her a coat or a suitcase. "The hearing is in 3 days. If you walk out that door, they take Leo and Sophia, you know that." Ilara finally faced him, her eyes blazing. "And what will you do, Alexander? By a judge, your money is the reason we are here. Your asterisk absences are the evidence. You are a smuggler. I'm an undocumented caregiver. In the eyes of that court, we are both criminals. The only innocence in this room is sleeping down the hall." For the next 48 hours, the penthouse became a war room, but the enemy was Alexander's own past. With Ilara's reluctant cooperation, his lawyers launched a frantic two-pronged attack. The first front was the family court, a petition to formally recognize Ilara as the children's de facto parent and primary guardian, based on the bizarre, prophetic detail of the birth certificate. The second front was damage control, with the financial crimes investigation, trying to wall off his personal life from his professional implosion. But every piece of information they uncovered revealed a deeper, more terrifying truth about the world Ilara had been navigating alone. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Clara, laid out the brutal statistics. "The system is not designed for this," she said, pointing to a study on her tablet. "Domestic workers are 3 times more likely to live in poverty. They have no safety net. For Ilara to have done what she did, maintain this home, these children, their health, on the cash salary you paid, is mathematically improbable. So where did the money come from?" Alexander looked at Ilara. She was sitting stiffly on the edge of a chair, her hands folded. "I had a second job," she said quietly. "Night shifts 3 times a week at a commercial laundry downtown for the first 5 years. Alexander felt the floor tilt. He had paid her $900 a week, thinking it was generous. He'd had no concept of the cost of living in his own city, of pediatric copays, of organic food, of the endless attrition of childhood. Her silence hadn't been obedience. It had been a sustained act of economic defiance. Then came the medical records. At Clara's request, Ilara produced a worn accordion file. Every doctor's visit, every specialist referral for Sophia's asthma, every note from Leo's speech therapist. Page after page under parent guardian was her signature, and in the relationship to patient field she had written mother. "You forged this?" Alexander asked, a knot in his throat. "I told the truth," Ilara corrected, her voice firm. "If I had written Maid, they would not have treated her. They would have demanded your presence, your signature, and you were never here, so I became what they needed me to be." But the most devastating revelation came not from a file, but from Leo. On the second night, Alexander tried to put the twins to bed, a ritual he had performed maybe a dozen times in their lives. Sophia, always more reserved, allowed it, but Leo, his son, pulled away. "I want Ella," he said, using the name they had called her since they could talk. "You do the story wrong." Alexander knelt, his heart cracking. "I can learn, buddy. Tell me what to do." Leo looked at him with the blunt honesty of a 9-year-old. "You're not here for the scary parts. Ella is. When I dream about the monster, or when Sophie can't breathe, you're in an airplane. Ella holds my hand." The child's words were a clinical diagnosis of Alexander's failure. His son saw him as a transient weather pattern, not a parent. The primary attachment, the unbreakable bond forged in the daily furnace of need and comfort, was with the woman he paid to clean his toilets. This is the crushing, biological truth of childcare. It's not about genetics, it's about presence. Research on childhood grief shows that the availability of a consistent caregiver after a trauma like losing a mother is the single biggest factor in a child's ability to heal. For Leo and Sophia, Ilara wasn't a substitute. She was the scaffold upon which their entire emotional world was built. And Alexander had been too busy profiting from other people's history to notice he was erasing his own. The pressure reached a breaking point the afternoon before the hearing. Clara delivered the bad news. The family court judge, reviewing the petition, had taken note of the parallel financial investigation. She would not rule on guardianship until the criminal matters were resolved, citing concerns about the children's environment. However, the original removal order for foster care was still active. In essence, the system had created a perfect catch-22. Alexander was too legally toxic to keep his kids, and Ilara was too legally invisible to claim them. They had 24 hours to devise a miracle. It was then, in the face of this impossible logic, that Ilara made her move. She had been silent for hours, staring out at the city skyline. She turned to Alexander and Clara. "There is another way," she said, "but it requires you to trust me with everything, and it requires you, Alexander, to finally stop running," she explained. The birth certificate was their only leverage, but it was stale. They needed to demonstrate a stable, committed, and legitimate family unit immediately. They needed to become, on paper and in practice, what they had never been, a partnership. The court wants to see roots, Ilara said. They want to see a home, not a transit lounge. They want to see shared responsibility, not a payroll entry. Her plan was audacious. They would petition not just for guardianship, but for Alexander to adopt a shared parental role with her through a second parent adoption, a legal mechanism almost unheard of in their circumstances. They would present a unified front. They would move out of the penthouse, a symbol of his transient life, and into a modest house with a lease in both their names. They would show bank statements proving commingled finances for the children's needs. They would, in short, perform the family they had failed to be. Alexander was stunned. "You want me to adopt with *U after everything?" "No," Ilara said, her gaze unwavering. "I want you to *parent with me. The adoption is just the receipt. The price is your time, your attention, your permanent presence. You give up the next shipment. You give up the flight to Geneva. You sit at the kitchen table and help with fractions. You become real, or we lose them forever." It was a ransom note, with his children's futures as the currency. But the kidnapper was his own former life. Alexander looked at this woman, her back straight, her hands stained from years of cleaning his messes, her eyes holding a ferocity he'd only ever seen in rival smugglers fighting for a fortune. He realized with a jolt that she wasn't asking for his money or his protection. She was demanding his humanity, and he had no idea if he had any left to give. He agreed. What choice did he have? The machinery swung into action. Clara filed a blizzard of new motions. A realtor, a discreet one, was called. That evening, Alexander cancelled a 7-figure deal over a statuette from Mesopotamia. The man on the other end of the line threatened him. For the first time, Alexander didn't care. He hung up and went to read a bedtime story, stumbling over the words while Ilara silently nodded encouragement from the doorway. But as they prepared for their final, desperate court appearance, a new threat emerged, one that made the family court look like a playground. Alexander's former business partner, a ruthless man named Victor who had been waiting for him to falter, got wind of the legal chaos. He saw Alexander's distraction as a vulnerability, and he knew that in their world, the ultimate leverage isn't money, it's family. An intercepted communication, provided by a paranoid contact still loyal to Alexander, contained a chillingly simple message from Victor to an associate. "The children are the key. Find the maid. She's the pressure point." The hearing was in 12 hours, and for the first time, the greatest danger to Leo and Sophia wasn't the foster care system. It was the criminal empire their father had built. Alexander had to protect his children from the state, and now, from the shadows of his own making. And the only person who could help him navigate both battles was the woman he'd spent 9 years trying not to see. He found Ilara packing a small go-bag for the twins. "We have another problem," he said, showing her the intercepted message. She read it, her face paling, but she didn't panic. She looked up, and in her eyes, Alexander saw not fear, but a cold, calculating resolve he recognized. It was the look of a survivor. "Then we don't go to court tomorrow," she said. "We go to war, and we use their own rules against them." Ilara's declaration of war wasn't metaphorical. It was a blueprint. While Alexander's instinct was to hire more guards, to fortify, to hide, hers was to dismantle. "Victor thinks I'm a vulnerability," she said, packing the penthouse like a general surveying a map. "He thinks a maid is a soft target. He does not know I have spent 9 years learning every secret of this house, of your life, of this city's underbelly, from the inside out. I know which deliveries are clean. I know which security men take bribes. I have listened to every phone call you thought was private." Her first move was preemptive evacuation. She didn't trust Alexander's usual security team. Using cash from her secret trust fund, she secured a short-term rental in a nondescript building in Queens under a false name she had maintained for years, a quiet rebellion against her own invisibility. She moved the twins there with the efficiency of a special forces operative, leaving behind their tablets and smart toys, anything that could be tracked. Alexander watched, stunned, as the quiet woman who folded his shirts transformed into a tactician. "How do you know how to do this?" he asked, his voice hushed. Ilara didn't look up from packing Sophia's inhaler. "When you are invisible, you learn to see everything, And when you love children who are not yours, you plan for every storm. With the children in a secure location known only to her and a trusted, off-the-books pediatric nurse she had befriended years prior, they turned to the dual-front battle. Clara, the lawyer, was their conduit to the legitimate world. She filed an emergency motion for a closed hearing, citing credible threats to the children's safety, which bought them 24 more hours. But the judge's patience was threadbare. "She needs a narrative she can believe in by 9 a.m. tomorrow," Clara told them over a secure line. "Right now, your story is a crime drama. We need a family drama. We need proof of bond, not just of danger." This demand forced a reckoning Alexander was not prepared for. The proof existed, but it was in a language he had never learned to read. It was in the thousands of photos on Alara's old, cracked phone, photos he had never seen. Pictures of first days of school, of science fair projects, of sick days on the couch. In every single one, the children were beaming, clinging to her. He was absent, a ghost in his own family album. Then there were the drawings, saved in a folder under Leo's bed. Crayon sketches of their family. A tall stick figure labeled Dad was often in the corner, sometimes in an airplane. In the center was a smiling figure with dark hair, labeled Mom, holding hands with two smaller figures. The evidence of his irrelevance was a curated museum, and he was the curator by neglect. But the criminal front was heating up faster. Victor, realizing the children had vanished, made a more direct play. He sent a message to Alexander's lawyer, Clara, posing as a concerned family friend, offering to provide testimony about Alexander's instability to the court. It was a poisoned apple. Accept the help and let Victor's influence into the legal case, or reject it and risk him releasing damning financial information to the authorities that would guarantee Alexander's arrest and the immediate seizure of the children. They were in a checkmate, with Victor controlling both the black and white pieces. It was then, staring at this impossible gridlock, that Alara revealed her second, far more dangerous layer. "We do not play his game," she said. "We change the board. Victor's power comes from secrets, from artifacts that do not exist on any registry. What if we remove his inventory?" Alexander stared at her. "You're talking about destroying millions of dollars worth of—" "I am talking about saving your children," she interrupted, her voice ice. "You know where his primary storage vault is? The one in the old meatpacking district. The one with the Titian that disappeared from Florence in 2011. Alexander felt a cold sweat. She wasn't supposed to know that. No one was. "How could you possibly? The humidity controls for that room," Ilara said, a faint, grim smile touching her lips, "are on the same smart home system as this penthouse. I control the thermostat, Alexander. I have always controlled the thermostat." The revelation was a seismic shift. This wasn't just a caregiver who had listened in. This was a woman who had systematically mapped the infrastructure of his entire criminal enterprise from the utility closet. She had access codes, shipment schedules, and digital backdoors. She had for years been the silent system administrator of his downfall. "You could have ruined me at any time," he whispered, a mix of terror and awe in his voice. "I could have," she acknowledged. "But ruin you would have meant traumatizing them, so I kept your secrets too, until now. Now we use them." The plan was audacious, illegal, and their only shot. They would not destroy Victor's vault. Instead, they would anonymously liberate its single most identifiable, hotly sought-after piece, the Titian, and deliver it with a trail of evidence pointing back to Victor. To the art crime unit of the FBI, it was a weaponization of Alexander's own expertise. Victor would be instantly plunged into a legal inferno, far too busy fighting extradition to worry about a custody battle. But pulling it off required Alexander to physically breach a rival's secure location, something that would get him killed if caught. As they planned in the dead of night, a new alarm blared. Clara called, her voice frantic. The family court judge, suspicious of the delay, had ordered an immediate, unscheduled home visit by a court officer to the penthouse to verify the children's living conditions. They were 45 minutes away. The children were safe in Queens, but their absence would be the final nail in the coffin. They had to be in that apartment, looking like a family, in half an hour. What followed was a surreal, high-speed performance. Alexander and Alara raced back to the penthouse. She called the nurse in Queens, instructing her to wake the children and put them on a video call. Using 2 large monitors and a clever camera setup Alara rigged from old equipment, they created a live feed illusion. When the stern court officer arrived, Leo and Sophia appeared to be sleeping peacefully in their beds down the hall, their images projected on screens in the dark rooms. Alexander and Ilara sat together on the sofa, a shared blanket over their knees, performing calm, united concern. It was a facade woven from technology and sheer nerve. The officer, satisfied by the peaceful domestic scene, left after 20 minutes. When the door closed, Alexander slumped forward, his head in his hands. The stress was a physical weight. He felt a hand on his shoulder, Ilara's hand. "You did well," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He looked up at her, truly looked. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the gray hairs at her temple that had not been there 9 years ago, the quiet strength that had held his world together. In that moment, the last wall around his heart crumbled. "I don't deserve you," he said, the words raw and true. "No," she agreed quietly, not unkindly. "You don't, but they do, and that is all that matters now." Emotional truce was short-lived. They had a Titian to steal. Using Ilara's access, they disabled the vault's external alarms and camera loops. Alexander, moving with a skill set he hated to use, infiltrated the building in the pre-dawn hours. The painting was there, just as she said. As he carefully secured it in a protective case, his phone vibrated. A text from Ilara. "Victor is moving, he knows. He's coming to the penthouse. He has people with him." Alexander's blood ran cold. He had led the wolf directly to her door. He abandoned subtlety, grabbing the painting and fleeing. He called her. "Get out now." "I can't," she said, her voice eerily calm. "If we both run, he burns everything. He will find the children. I am the puzzle he wants to solve. I will be the puzzle that breaks him." Before Alexander could protest, she hung up. He raced across the city, terror giving him speed. When he arrived at the penthouse, it was too late. Victor's black sedan was idling out front. Alexander charged inside, the case with the $1 million painting forgotten in the lobby. He burst into the living room to find a standoff. Victor, a sleek, cold-eyed man, stood with 2 enforcers. Ilara stood opposite them, alone, holding a fireplace poker like a sword. She wasn't cowering. She was staring Victor down. "You think you can threaten me?" Victor was sneering. "A cleaning woman? I am the woman who knows the combination to your offshore account in Cyprus," Ilara replied, her voice clear and cutting. "The one you think is secure. It is 6/22/1975, your father's birthday. You are not a sophisticated man, Victor. You are a sentimental one, and sentiment is a weakness." Victor's face went white. The information was catastrophic. He nodded to his men. "Take her." Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between them and Ilara. "Touch her," he growled, the voice of the smuggler returning, full of lethal promise, "and I will feed you your own assets, one wire transfer at a time." But the real power play came from Ilara. She held up her phone, a live audio feed streaming. "You are on speaker, Victor, with the Art Crime Unit. They have just heard you order an abduction, and they have the location of your vault." From the phone, a tinny, official voice said, "This is the FBI, remain where you are." Victor and his men froze, then fled. The trap had been sprung. But as the sound of sirens grew closer, Ilara's strength finally buckled. The adrenaline drained and she swayed on her feet. Alexander caught her. He held her as she trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer expenditure of a decade's worth of silent resilience. The authorities arrived, but so did Clara. The lawyer had been listening too, and she had brought a family court commissioner with her, witnessing the entire event. The commissioner saw a father protecting a mother, a family defending its home from an external threat. The narrative had finally, irrevocably, shifted from crime drama to family drama. As the FBI took their statements and secured the Titian, Clara pulled Alexander aside. "The hearing is in 4 hours. The commissioner will report what she saw. It changes everything. But you need to decide right now what you are going to say. Who is Ilara Santos to you?" Alexander looked across the room. Ilara was sipping water, her eyes closed, looking younger and more fragile than he had ever seen her. He knew the answer. It was the only truth left in his shattered world. "She is everything," he said. "She is their mother, and she is my partner." Clara nodded. "Then let's go to court and make it legal." But as they turned to leave, Alexander's phone buzzed with an alert. The financial crimes investigation had just frozen all his assets, including the trust fund Ilara had built for the children. The final battle was not with Victor or even the family court. It was with the consequences of his own life, and it was just beginning. The asset freeze was a guillotine blade suspended over their fragile new beginning. In the cold light of the courthouse morning, Alexander Vance stood with nothing but the suit on his back and the woman beside him. The money was gone. The empire was ashes. All that remained was the truth they had to sell to skeptical judge, that a smuggler and a maid, bound by 9 years of silent devotion, were a real family. But as they walked into the hearing, a final, brutal twist awaited. The state's attorney had a new witness, ready to testify that Ilara Santos was not who she claimed to be. The family courtroom was smaller than Alexander expected, all pale wood and fluorescent light. Judge Henderson, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for zero tolerance, presided. On one side sat the Child Protective Services attorney, Gail, the social worker, looking pained but resolved. On the other side sat Alexander, Ilara, and Clara. The twins were in a waiting room with the nurse. The air was thick with finality. The state presented its case first. It was a clinical demolition of Alexander's parenthood. Flight logs, bank records showing no regular expenses for the children, security footage of him leaving the penthouse for weeks at a time. Then they turned to Ilara. They acknowledged the birth certificate anomaly but dismissed it as a tragic error or possible fraud by the deceased mother. They presented her as a compassionate but ultimately undocumented employee with no legal standing, whose prolonged presence had unfortunately enabled Alexander's neglect. The recommendation was unchanged: temporary foster care while a suitable, stable guardian could be found. Then Clara stood. She began not with Alexander but with Ilara. She entered into evidence the medical file, the thousands of photos, the children's drawings. She called the pediatric nurse, who testified to Ilara's unwavering, expert care. She called the twins' teacher, who stated that for 9 years, Ella had been the only parent at every conference, every play, every emergency call. It was a portrait of motherhood, meticulously detailed. When Clara finished, Judge Henderson looked at Ilara. "Miss Santos, you have performed the duties of a parent, but the law requires more than duty. It requires right. What is your interest in these children?" Ilara stood. She did not look at the judge at first. She looked at Alexander and then at the closed door behind which her children waited. "My interest," she began, her voice clear, "is that I promised them every night that I would not leave. When their mother died, the world became a scary, unstable place. I became the stable ground. I am their interest. I am their safety. I am not their maid. I am their home." It was simple, undeniable, and it shifted the energy in the room. Then came Alexander's turn. Clara had advised him to be contrite, to list the changes he would make. But when he took the stand, he discarded the script. The judge asked him why the court should believe he could change. Alexander was silent for a long moment. "You shouldn't," he said finally, to the shock of his own lawyer. "For 9 years, I believed love was a thing you provided for from a distance. I thought my money was my love. I was wrong. Love is time. Love is presence. I have missed 6,578 days of that love. I cannot get them back. All I can do is offer the 6,578 days that come next, and I can offer them with her." He pointed to Ilara. "She taught me that. She built the family I was too blind to see. I am not asking you to give me my children back, Your Honor. I am asking you to let me join the family that already exists." It was a surrender, not a defense, and it was the first truly honest thing he had said in a decade. The judge's expression was unreadable. Then the state's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we have a final witness regarding the suitability of Ilara Santos." From a side door entered a man Alexander vaguely recognized, an associate from his early days, a low-level fixer named Marco. Marco took the stand and swore that Ilara Santos was an alias, that her real name was Elena Moretti, and that she was the daughter of a known art forger from Naples, implying she had been planted in Alexander's home as part of a long con. The accusation landed like a grenade. Alexander stared at Ilara. Her face had drained of color. Clara was on her feet objecting, but the damage was done. Judge Henderson fixed Ilara with a piercing gaze. "Miss Santos, is this true?" Entire narrative teetered on the brink. Everything they had built, the trust, the partnership, the story of sacrifice, could unravel in seconds. Ilara stood slowly. She looked not at the judge but at Marco, a flicker of cold recognition in her eyes. Then she turned to the bench. "My name is Ilara Santos," she stated firmly, "but my mother was Elena Moretti." She took a deep breath, revealing the last secret. She was a restorer, not a forger. She worked in a museum in Naples. She died when I was 12. She spent her life preserving beauty for very little money. I came to this country alone. I took her first name as my middle name to remember her. There is no con. There is only a daughter trying to do honest work, trying to be better than the poverty that claimed her mother. She looked at Alexander, her eyes pleading for him to believe her. I did not lie to you. I just buried the part of me that was too painful to say out loud. In that moment, Alexander understood. Her expertise with the art climate controls, her sharp eye, her quiet dignity, they were her inheritance. She hadn't been a plant. She was a refugee from the same world of art and loss he inhabited, just on the opposite, impoverished side of the canvas. He stood up. Your Honor, I knew her mother's reputation. Elena Moretti was a brilliant artist who repaired great works. If my children have inherited even a fraction of that grace from Ilara, I am blessed. This doesn't discredit her. It explains her. It explains the devotion. The hearing recessed. In the hallway, Alexander pulled Ilara aside. Why didn't you tell me? She wiped a tear. Because in our world, Alexander, the daughter of a poor restorer, is just another servant. I want to be judged on what I did, not where I came from. He pulled her into an embrace, not as employer and employee, not as co-conspirators, but as two broken people clinging to the same lifeline. You are their mother, he whispered into her hair. You are their mother. When Judge Henderson returned, her verdict was swift. She dismissed the petition for foster care. She granted temporary legal and physical custody to Alexander Vance and Ilara Santos jointly, ordering the immediate commencement of a second parent adoption process. She mandated family therapy and unannounced home visits for 6 months, but her most piercing comment was directed at the system itself. The court recognizes that the primary attachment for these children is to Miss Santos. The law, however, was not built to see her. That is a failure of the law, not a failure of her love. This arrangement is unorthodox, but the evidence of a functional, loving family is overwhelming. Sometimes, the family we find is stronger than the family we are born into. They had won, but the victory was conditional and costly. Outside the courthouse, federal agents were waiting for Alexander. The art smuggling investigation, bolstered by the recovered Titian and Victor's frantic testimony to save himself, was moving forward. He was placed under arrest. As they handcuffed him, he looked at Ilara, panic in his eyes. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his cheek. You will face this, she said, her voice steel. You will not run, we will be here. We will visit, and when you come home, you will come home to a family. This is the price, pay it. Alexander went quietly. For the first time, he was not fleeing consequences. He was walking toward them, because something worth protecting waited on the other side. Ilara took the twins back to the modest rental in Queens. Using the last of her separate savings, she enrolled them in a new school. She found a job as an assistant at a community arts center, her inherent knowledge finally yielding a legitimate paycheck. The story leaked to the press, of course, Smuggler's Children Saved by Maid. It became a tabloid sensation, a modern fairy tale. But the reality was grittier: grocery budgets, homework help, and video calls with a federal detention center. The final surprising detail emerged 6 months later, during Alexander's plea bargain negotiations. His cooperation against Victor and other syndicate members earned him a reduced sentence. But the prosecution also presented a sealed file, evidence that had mysteriously appeared, detailing the financial crimes of several corrupt officials who had been slowing the children's adoption process. The file was meticulous, anonymous, and devastatingly effective. The roadblocks vanished. Clara knew who was responsible. She visited Ilara and simply said, "You learned more than just climate controls, didn't you?" Ilara just smiled. A mother protects her children by any means necessary. Alexander was sentenced to 18 months in a low-security prison. He served 14. Every week, Ilara brought the children to visit. They talked about school, about plans. He missed Leo's 10th birthday, but Ilara filmed the whole party and smuggled a piece of cake in her purse. The slow, awkward, beautiful process of building a real relationship began through plexiglass and phone lines. The day Alexander was released, Ilara and the twins were waiting outside the gates. Leo and Sophia ran to him, not with the hesitation of before, but with the open joy of children who now knew he would stay. He hugged them, then looked over their heads at Ilara. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair down, looking more at peace than he had ever seen her. In her hand, she held a single sheet of paper, the finalized adoption decree. It listed Alexander Vance as father and Ilara Santos as second parent, their family recognized by the state. They drove not to the penthouse, which had been sold to settle legal debts, but to a small house in Brooklyn with a yard. It was leased in both their names. That night, after the children were asleep, Alexander and Ilara sat on the back steps. "The trust fund is gone," he said, the old shame returning. "The money you saved," Ilara shook her head. "I did not save money, I saved children. The account was just a number, we have what matters." She leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture of exhausted, hard-won familiarity. "What now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "we live, you get a job, I have mine, we make dinners, we help with homework, we are boring and normal and together." And that is exactly what they did. Alexander, using his knowledge legitimately, began consulting for insurance companies on art security. Ilara rose to manage the art center. They were not lovers, but partners bound by a love greater than romance. The shared, ferocious love of two people who had fought hell and high water to build a home for their children. The maid who was told to stay silent had finally found her voice, not to accuse, but to claim what was hers, a family. And the smuggler who traded in priceless objects finally learned the value of the one thing he could never buy back: time. Their story is a testament to the families we choose and to the quiet, world-altering power of devotion that asks for no recognition but deserves nothing less. So what is the true cost of the love that holds a family together? The story of Alexander and Ilara is not just about a smuggler and a maid. It is a stark ledger of a debt that can never be repaid and a devotion that never asked for payment. For 9 years, the global economy of care ran silently through their penthouse, an invisible multi-trillion-dollar industry powered by women like Ilara, whose labor is foundational and yet formally worthless. If all the unpaid and underpaid care work done by domestic workers was given a monetary value, it would eclipse entire sectors like manufacturing. We build our lives on this invisible scaffold and call it luck. Alexander's journey was a crash course in seeing the architecture he had taken for granted. His realization did not begin with a grand gesture, but with a legal threat, a cold piece of paper that forced him to quantify what was priceless. He discovered that his children's world had a different center of gravity, and it wasn't him. This is the silent, biological truth of attachment. It is not conferred by a title, but forged in the daily, unglamorous furnace of showing up. A child's heart maps to consistency, not to DNA. Ilara's victory was not in becoming a mother, but in being formally recognized as the mother she had always been. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Why does our legal system struggle to see the families that form in the shadows of necessity? Why are the Ilaras of the world, overwhelmingly women, often immigrants, triply burdened by poverty, legal invisibility, and emotional exhaustion? The research is clear. These caregivers face some of the highest rates of burnout, with limited protections and almost no social safety net. They perform the most sacred work a society has, and we have built a world that systematically ignores their sacrifice until a crisis forces our hand. In the end, Alexander Vance traded a fortune in stolen art for a modest house in Brooklyn and the exhausting, glorious mundane reality of parenthood. Ilara Santos traded her anonymity for a legally recognized family and the peace of knowing the children she loved would never be taken from her. They built something authentic from the ruins of a fabricated life. Their bond is not a fairy tale romance, but something perhaps more durable, a partnership forged in mutual debt, fierce loyalty, and the shared project of two wounded people giving their children a softer world. Their resolution whispers a challenging truth. Sometimes the most heroic figure in a story isn't the one on the epic quest. It's the one holding down the fort, making sure there's a home to return to. It's the person who does the work not for glory, but for love. And in a world obsessed with headlines and hustle, perhaps we need to look closer at the quiet devotion happening right under our noses, in our own homes, and ask ourselves if we are truly seeing it. What did you think? Was Ilara's silent sacrifice a form of strength, or should she have demanded recognition from the start? Did Alexander's redemption feel earned, or was it too little too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story of hidden devotion and a family forged in fire resonated with you, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps others find this channel. Share it with a friend who appreciates a deep, human drama, and subscribe for more documentaries that explore the untold stories living in the shadows of our everyday world.